ITG 186, Skylar Callahan, Jed Drenning. We've got Phil Steele in the gun with us here in just a moment.
You are now watching Believe.
ITG.
With special guest, Phil Steele.
Author of the College Football Bible.
You can see things before they happen.
Well, I definitely like West Virginia's offensive line.
All you got to do is bet on the winner and you'll never lose.
I like the Mountaineers to win this one.
Taylor, touchdown!
To me, the key matchup here is that West Virginia run game. Hey, a real pleasure being on. Thanks for having me on the In the Gun podcast.
Because once you enter this family, there's no getting out.
We are officially putting the Penn State game behind us. Jed, so no more mentions of the Penn State game. Actually, well, we do got to bring it up one more time in our picks from last week, which we'll get to in a second. Then we'll get to Phil Steele. But first, a thank you to BetOnline for presenting this episode of ITG. BetOnline, where the game begins. And, of course, our friends at Toothman Ford. We all know cars cost less in Grafton. So, Jed, let's do it one more time. Let's bring up the Penn State game, and then we can move on from that filthy thing.
Okay, the questions we asked, the picks we made within the game last week. WVU last year averaged 266 rush yards a game at home, most by a Big 12 team since 2019. Penn State last year led the nation in rush defense on the road, allowing just 44 yards per game on the road. We said quite simply, who will rush for more yards, Penn State or West Virginia? We both picked Penn State. Unfortunately, we both were right. Penn State is 222 to 85. Question number two, we talked about the fact that Drew Aller, surprisingly, had rushed for more conversions on third down than Garrett. Drew Aller with 12 third down conversions with his legs last year, Garrett with 11. And we said, what will happen? Which QB will rush for a first down on a third down play? Garrett, Drew Aller, both, or neither? You said Garrett.
Yeah.
Garrett did not. I said both. Unfortunately, I got the Drew Aller part right. He did it a couple times. Garrett rushed for one on a fourth down, but not a third down. So we both missed that. And then we had one on penalties. Last year in Happy Valley, Penn State famously had just one penalty for 5 yards. We said with 3 new coordinators in a hostile environment, certainly that can't happen again. So we pegged it at 46 and a half penalty yards for Penn State, over or under. You picked under. I picked over. Penn State went 8 penalties for 60 yards. I got that right. You got that wrong. Pass attempts last year. Drew Aller threw it 29 times for West Virginia, or against West Virginia. Andy Kotelnicki at Kansas averaged 24 a game. We kind of split the difference. We said over under 26 and a half pass attempts by Drew Aller against West Virginia, over or under 26 and a half. You picked over. You said, but barely. I picked under. Drew Aller threw it 17 times against West Virginia. I was right on that one. You were wrong. And that does it for the Penn State game. So I guess I was
Between that
3
and
for 4 with the Garrett miss, and you were 1 for 4.
between that and the Big 12 picks that we make every week, quite a rough week for me to start out. That's all right.
Well, I'm like George Costanza. I want to leave wanting more. I got to get out of here. That's
Yeah.
it for me. Showmanship.
I'm kind of like the West Virginia offense right now. I just started slow. This is kind of my tune-up week as well, so I'm going to get back on track. So speaking of this week, let's see what you got in store for me in our picks.
Okay. So with the Albany Great Danes coming to Morgantown for the first time ever, I love the name. Love the name. Tackles for loss. First question. Last year, against its FCS opponent, Duquesne, West Virginia's defense managed 14 TFLs, a season high 14. Here's how it stacks up in the last 5 FCS games, the 5 that Neil Brown has faced at West Virginia. Here's your TFL totals. 14 last year, 7, 10, 9, 6. That's an average of 9.2 per game against the FCS opponents. West Virginia had only 2 last week versus Penn State. Albany allowed 5 versus Long Island in that win. So I ask you quite simply, over under West Virginia's defensive TFLs against Albany, 8.5.
And you're not even buttering me up here. This is a tough one right out of the gate. I'm gonna lean with the over. I feel like that front seven has got to be hungry and ticked off after last week. And even though Albany's offensive line is pretty decent, I think this is a game where they're going to run the ball a lot. There's going to be a lot of opportunities for TFLs, and quite simply, size and strength is gonna be in West Virginia's advantage. So I'm going to go over.
Okay, to make it interesting, I'll go under. Yeah, that's the point. The strength of this Long Island, the strength of this Albany team is its offensive line with 4 returning starters. 8.5 is a chunky number. I certainly hope I'm wrong, but I'm going to go under. I'm going to go under the 8.5 TFLs against that Albany offense. And question number 2, we're going to discuss yards per carry. West Virginia's offensive yards per carry last year against FCS opponent Duquesne, 6.2 yards per carry. Again, let's go back through the 5 FCS opponents that Neil Brown has faced at West Virginia. 6.2 last year, 7.0 the year before, 3.6 against Long Island in that big win 3 years ago. That was they bottled up Letty Brown in that game. Garrett Green was the leading rusher with almost 100 yards as the backup quarterback. It was just a strange game. Before that, 6.5. And before that, I hate to even mention anything about 2019 in the West Virginia rushing game, 1.4 yards per carry in that win over James Madison in 2019. Now, last week, Albany gave up 179 yards rushing to Long Island, and Long Island averaged 5.8 yards per carry against this Albany defense. We talked in the preview. Albany has lost, depending on how you define starter, at least 10 defensive starters, or maybe even all 11. They've lost at least their top 13 tacklers, maybe even their top 15. So it's a complete rebuild on the defensive side of the football for Albany. Again, last week against Long Island, 5.8 yards per carry was the number. I bring that up because I'm going to give you an over-under West Virginia's offense against Albany. Over under 6.5 yards per carry on the ground. What say you?
I'm gonna lean a little under. I think that's it's over 6 yards. I think it's kind of be in that 6.2, 6.4 range. But I think they're gonna run the ball a fair amount. They're not gonna get huge chunk plays. They'll have a few, but I think this is also a game where they really want to air it out too. So I'm kind of conflicted. I think most of their yardage will probably their chunk plays will come from the passing game in this one. So I'm going to say under, but it's not by much. It's a good number.
I'm going to agree. But here's my logic. Their head coach, Greg Gattuso, is a former defensive lineman. I'm sure he's been salty all week over the fact that they gave up so many yards on the ground to Long Island. I'm sure that coming into the West Virginia game, that is the last thing they want to do, and they will sell their defensive soul to prevent it. It might be a tall ask for them, but I think Greg Gattuso is going to have them and this completely rebuilt front seven tall to the task. Under 6.5, that's a big number. That's a big number. 6.5. So jumping on to halftime scores, total points. Let's look at the 5 halftime scores in West Virginia's 5 FCS games under Neil Brown. Last year, Duquesne, after the disjointed start and the rain delay, which took place in the second quarter, in large part because of Hudson Clement, West Virginia separated by the half, and it was 35-10. 2 years ago, 45-7. 3 years ago, 38-0. Then back to 42-7. We were actually trailing James Madison 7-3. But if you look at the last 4, which are more accurate barometers, probably the average combined points in the first half is 46, just a touch over 46 combined points. So let's go combined points, not West Virginia points, combined points. Over under 45.5 combined points in the first half.
I'll go under. I could see this game being a little disjointed at the start and kind of some restless Mountaineer fans, voicing their frustrations. But in terms of the entire game, like I don't think this is going to be a game West Virginia have to sweat at all. But like you mentioned in the preview, these games happen all the time where it's a little sluggish at the start. So I'm going to go under, and it's kind of be like a 21-7 type of half.
I'll go over. Keep it interesting. And then finally, before we get to Phil, we have one last question. Takeaways by the West Virginia defense or the West Virginia team at large. Will count special teams takeaways as well. When you look at takeaways in these FCS games, we talked in the preview, West Virginia is not just a turnover-starved team, it's a turnover-starved program. We desperately need some takeaways as a team and as a program. Last year against Duquesne, we managed 2. But in the 3 previous matchups against FCS opponents, one takeaway, and one takeaway. You have to go all the way back to the JMU game in 2019 before you find a game with 3. So, over-under takeaways by West Virginia against Albany. Over-under 2.5.
I was hoping you get 1.5. I'll go under again. I think they get 2. I think they get an interception and a fumble.
I'll make it simple. I'll go over. I'll have the glass half full instead of half empty. And that wraps it up with this week's picks against the Albany Great Danes. Again, love the name.
Yeah, hopefully I get some better luck this week, but we'll get some more thoughts on college football, West Virginia, all that good stuff from Phil Steele. Maybe he'll give us pointers on who to take in terms of the spread this week. Stay tuned. We'll have Phil here in just a second, but also want to send out a thank you to Fortis for roof performance and financial certainty guaranteed. Be sure to visit fortis.us.com. Hang tight. We'll be back with Phil Steele after the break.
For nearly 20 years, Fortis has been the nation's leader in providing guaranteed roof performance programs for commercial buildings. Fortis offers roof performance solutions that feature extensive initial and ongoing reconditioning for commercial buildings as an alternative to traditional replacement, with long-term performance guarantees that are backed by global leader Lloyd's of London. Fortis offers a comprehensive range of roof performance management programs that provide financial security, extend the life of our customers' roofs, and make a significant impact on ROI. Fortis is currently improving performance and increasing ROI for customers at more than 4,800 locations, with more than 140 million square feet protected, including many Fortune 500 companies that have turned to Fortis to save money, gain financial certainty, and extend the life of their existing roofs. Fortis has helped customers save more than $520 million in capital roof replacement costs for an average ROI of over 250%. To learn more, visit fortis.us.com. Fortis, roof performance and financial certainty guaranteed.
Nobody supports the blue and gold Mountaineers like Toothman Ford. With over 20 NIL deals and counting, Toothman Ford continues to rally behind our student athletes. And it's time we rally and support the dealer that supports the Mountaineers. Not only does Toothman Ford offer the best prices in the state on pre-owned, their never over MSRP campaign on new Fords guaranteed to save you thousands. Drive with pride all season long, knowing you're supporting the dealer that fuels our Mountaineers. Toothman Ford, where cars cost less, in Grafton and at toothmanford.com.
And we are back in the gun with Phil Steele. It's Phil Friday. We're going to get his thoughts on a couple of big top 25 matchups before we go really deep into the Big 12. A lot of good Big 12 games this weekend. Phil, how are you doing? Thanks for coming back on. And while you're at it, go ahead and let everyone know where they can get your stuff. And also, with West Virginia playing Albany, an FCS team this week, if they want to deep dive on Albany, where can they find that stuff at?
Yeah, I appreciate that. First of all, the magazine's at Barnes & Noble and Books A Million this year exclusively. So if you haven't got one yet, which you really should have got one by now, but you could still get it. You're going to use it all football season long. Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, or philsteele.com. Every Thursday now, I put out the Phil Steele Plus Tour with selections, another nice 4-2 week last week. The tour is actually on a 30-14 run over the last 9 weeks of the regular season. But you mentioned Albany. And Jed, tell me a little bit about the FCS magazine. What have you discovered this week?
I'm gonna say this, Bill. During my preparation, obviously, your magazine itself at large has always been a go-to for me for a host of reasons. But when you look at these FCS opponents, and every one of us have one, it's difficult to find information on these opponents. And you do just as thorough a job in vetting these FCS teams as you do in the FBS team. So if you're listening to this and you're a member of the West Virginia media, and I know there's other podcasters that listen to this and on down the line, you can quickly and easily, we're going to drop this thing on Friday. Before the Albany game kicks off Saturday night, you can spend Friday reading the digital version of what Phil has to say about the Albany Great Danes and any other FCS opponent that you want to see. that's reason enough to get that digital version of it so you can access the FCS information, because it's just difficult to find. As somebody who's done this for a long time, combing through local media, looking at local articles, looking at local previews, Phil makes it much easier. It's all in one place, in one source, FCS and otherwise. I strongly encourage you, if you're not already doing so, to dive into that side of it just to get the FCS information.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, the FCS magazine is available digital only. It's at philsteele.com, just $25, and it's got 2 full pages on every FCS team, plus some other articles. All the articles we use, the metrics articles that we use in the magazine, we have them for the FCS as well.
Good stuff. And so let's go ahead and kick us off here in the top 25. It's a big one in Ann Arbor, in the big house. Texas and Michigan, the Wolverines in their first game without Coach Harbaugh officially. They beat Fresno State 30-10. Not the most impressive performance. They found a way to get the job done. Phil, I don't know about this one. It seems like Texas is the better team, but it feels like they have more pressure on them in this game because they've got a little bit more of a challenging schedule than Michigan. Does Texas need this one more than Michigan?
I think Texas does. If you look at Michigan's schedule, I think if they win either this one or the game against Oregon, they'll probably make the playoff as a 10-win team this year. So I think Michigan Michigan's going to lose to Ohio State. But they'll have to beat Oregon if they lose this one. Texas actually has a pretty easy SEC schedule, and I say that because they only have 3 true SEC road games this year, and they're against Vanderbilt, Arkansas, and Texas A&M, all winnable. The rest of the games are at home. The Oklahoma game's a neutral site, so I think it's an important game for both teams. Now, I don't want to overreact to last week, but Texas looked great. And Michigan didn't. I mean, Michigan's offensive line didn't open up holes like you would have expected against Fresno State. They used 2 different offenses last week. They used the pro-style offense with Davis Warren. They used the spread-style offense with Alex Orji. They weren't overwhelming. The only led by 6, got a late touchdown, then the interception return for a touchdown, made it a 20-point. And I do want to point out, though, that last year they actually had 3 games where they had under 300 yards offense, like they did last year. So even their national championship team struggled on offense at times last year. But I think I had Texas the better team, the more experienced team. They looked better last week. I do think Texas goes into the big house and comes out of there with a win. Tough to go against defending national champs as a home dog, especially getting a touchdown. But I'm going to lean with Texas in this one.
And with Michigan looking sluggish in their opener, it's probably a good time to plug it if you haven't seen it. The Connor Steigens documentary on Netflix was very interesting and entertaining, but it's a good watch. It really is. But let's jump to the Dukes Mayo Classic. I say Dukes Mayo, and Mountaineer fans just perk up, right? So you have Tennessee and NC State squaring off in Charlotte, a battle of top 25s. Tony Gibson and company, our buddy Tony, is the defensive coordinator at NC State, as an 8.5-point dog. The last I saw, they struggled a little bit early, but separated in their opener against Western Carolina. What do you say about this matchup between the Volunteers and the Wolfpack down in Charlottesville?
Yeah, and this is another game where I think what we see is everybody watched last week's games, and there's a little bit of an adjustment because Tennessee looks so good. Nico Iamaleava is a guy that, he hit 79% of his passes, basically only played the first half. They had almost 500 yards offense in the first half, explosive. And as you touched on, NC State last week was struggling with West Carolina. In fact, in the fourth quarter, they trailed that thing 21-17. They got the last 3 scores of the game, including a 50-yard touchdown run with 1:50 left to gain some margin. But they do have Casey Concepcion. They do have Jordan Waters at running back and Grayson McCall at QB. So they've got weapons. I think NC State was looking ahead to this Tennessee game last week. That's why they struggled. I do think we're going to see a much better version of NC State this week. I think Tennessee's a better team. I had Tennessee about a touchdown favorite in the game. Like I said, the spread's going up because of what we saw last week out of the 2 teams. I don't want to overreact to last week. So I'm still going to keep it at Tennessee by 7. And I think it's going to be a good football game.
Yeah, I think NC State's one of those teams in the ACC that might be a sleeper right now, but ends up being a real player in that conference when we come to November. So Going to the Big 12 now. We've got a lot of Big 12 action to talk about. Let's start with Arkansas and Oklahoma State. Obviously, the Razorbacks kind of just walked through their week one opponent in Arkansas Pine Bluff, winning 70-0. Oklahoma State, they did pretty well in their first game against South Dakota State, a game that we talked about here on this show as it might be one of those challenging kind of situations for the Cowboys, but they handled it fairly well, 44-20. Phil, what are the odds that Arkansas can stroll into Boone Pickens Stadium and pull out a win?
You know, as long as Coach Pittman is still the head coach there, I got to give Arkansas a chance. And let me take you back to last year. Last year, Arkansas didn't have a very good team. KJ Jefferson was banged up, not 100%. Rocket Sanders barely played last year. And Arkansas went through a 4-7 season. They had the toughest 4-game stretch of any team in the country. They had to play at LSU. Then they played A&M away from home, at Ole Miss, and at Alabama. An incredibly tough schedule. What they do last year, they almost beat LSU. They only lost by 3. They almost beat Ole Miss. They only lost by 7. They almost beat Alabama. They only lost by 3. And that was with a weak Arkansas team. This year, they bring in Bobby Petrino. They've got a quarterback that's got more juice this year in Taylon Green. I like Jaquindon Jackson, the running back that they bring in from Utah. And they're better on offense with Bobby Petrino. The defense has improved, and they're always dangerous as a dog. We've seen it for years. Arkansas is a big dog, and they always take these teams tight. So I love Oklahoma State. I liked them last week against South Dakota State. They did well. Alan Bowman last year, barely above 50% on the ratio. He had a 3-0 ratio. They've got Ollie Gordon, but I just think Arkansas always plays these big boys tough. So I think there is a chance for the upset. I mean, they almost upset Ole Miss, LSU, Alabama last year. I think Arkansas's got that opportunity. I'll take the points with Arkansas in this one.
Speaking of Oklahoma State, shout out to Mike Gundy. I don't know if you guys saw this or not, but he's doing his weekly coaches radio show at Legacy Village Senior Living in front of the senior citizens, and they're eating it with a big spoon. So shout out to Gundy for that. Nothing's more Gundy-like than that. That's just terrific. But let's move on to Kansas State at Tulane, a bit of a revenge game from 2 years ago. A lot of people might forget, I know you don't, that Tulane snuck into the Little Apple and knocked off a Kansas State team 2 years ago that went on to win the Big 12. This time around, Kansas State's ranked 17th. They're a heavy favorite, pushing 10. I think it was -9 the last I saw. Tulane, of course, a program in transition with the new staff. What do you think about this matchup between the Wildcats and the Green Wave, Phil?
Yeah, I actually like what I saw at Tulane last week. Now, granted, it was Southeast Louisiana, but they did what was expected. They played extremely well. Darian Mensah actually got the start over Ty Thompson, which was a little bit of a surprise for me, but he did well. He had 10 of 12. And, they got Mekhi Hughes at running back. Avery Johnson, it came in with so much hype. And then last week, they only led 17-3 at the half, sort of a sluggish game, pulled away in the second half. And the defense held UT Martin 134 yards, but they were expected to win big. So I think both teams good. Kansas State, as you mentioned, playing with a little bit of revenge, but they've got a Friday game on deck against Arizona. Now, that's not a conference game, but I don't think it's a conference game, is it, guys?
That's a good question. There were a couple of those quirky games from a scheduling standpoint that you might be right, Phil. That might not be counted in the Big 12 standings.
Think it is.
Yeah, I think that's not a but it's still a Friday night game against Arizona, for crying out loud, in a short week. So I think there may be a little look ahead to that. I've got Kansas State winning this game. I think Tulane's probably going to be a little bit surprising under Summerall this year. But I got Kansas State by 7. So I'm a little bit of a lean to the home dog. Nothing major on that one, but I think that look ahead to Arizona is going to be big.
While West Virginia is hopefully taking care of Albany this week, the next week's opponent, Pitt, will be playing in the River City rivalry this week against Cincinnati. So good thing there for West Virginia. Pitt's going to have to really strain to win this one. It's on the road. Last year, they lost to the Bearcats at home, one of their 9 losses. Phil, I don't really know what to make of this game. It feels like Pitt is probably the better team, but Cincinnati beat them a year ago. They got them at home now. They're off to a 1-0 start, even though they didn't look great against Towson. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, both teams had losing records last year. Both teams going to have winning records this year, I think, when you look at these teams. Pitt's offense is just supercharged this year. They've got a new offensive coordinator. They've gone to the fast-paced offense. You're going to see them have a lot more plays. You look at the opening game of the season, they ran 80 plays. Eli Holstein, the Alabama transfer, had 30 of 40. Now, granted, with Kent State, but Kent State's not a bad team. And they really dominated that Kent State game more than the final score would indicate. You look at the halftime, it was 28-14, right? So you think, oh, Pitt's defense. No, they gave up a punt return, like bounced into the player. Kent returned it for a touchdown. Kent only had 48 yards at the half. Pitt had 329 at the half. Desmond Reed is a shorter running back, but he is a bowling ball of a running back. Comes over from the same offense that their offense coordinator Bell ran last year. So I think Desmond Reed, Eli Holstein gives them a completely different offense, and the defense looks solid. Cincinnati, I got to tell you, last year, Bearcat games, I picked against Cincy almost every week, and almost every week at the half, I'm like, oh, I'm in trouble. Cincy's going to win this thing because they look great. They just didn't have the depth last year. Well, this year they have the depth. I wasn't pleased they gave up 438 yards to Towson, but maybe they overlooked Towson a little bit. I like Sorsby at quarterback, the Indiana transfer, at 71%. Evan Pryor at running back ran for over 100 yards. So I think these two teams are very talented. I'm going to give the home edge to Cincy and pick the Bearcats to come out with the win here, but I think it's going to be a great football game. And these are two play on teams this year. I think if you play on Pitt and on Cincinnati this year, at the end of the year, you'll have won money just overall.
You just hit on something critical that Mountaineer fans will want to monitor as we draw closer to the brawl. They, of course, recently lost feature back Rodney Hammond. Desmond Reed stepped in, and he is looking pretty good, just like you said, Phil. So something Mountaineer fans will want to keep an eye on. Let's jump to Baylor, Utah. And what I think of when I look at this game, I remember last year in Waco when these two teams squared off. You're the one that told us not so fast. This might be a far more competitive game than people are saying. And sure enough, it was a 20-13 outcome, much closer as you called than most people were expecting. This year, Baylor has to head to Salt Lake, and that's a much taller task. Last week in game one, with our guy Jake Spavital installing a new system on the offensive side to replace Jeff Grimes, breaking in a new quarterback and transfer Dequan Finn, everything went according to plan. But when you step into Salt Lake City, something tells me that plan might look a little different, and it's easy to get punched in the mouth by this Utah defense, which pitched a shutout in week one. You got Utah as a heavy favorite, minus 15 last time I saw, Phil. What do you think of the Bears heading to Salt Lake City to face the Utes?
Yeah, and Utah's a much different team in Rice-Eccles Stadium. I believe they've lost 2 home games the last 5 years. Last year's game against Baylor, you hit it right on the head. Baylor led that thing 13-3. In fact, Utah didn't lead the game until 17 seconds left when they got an 11-yard TD run to pull out the 20-13 win. So that was their first lead of the game with 17 seconds left in it. Now, this year, Utah's a vastly improved team. Cam Rising was stepped out last week. He had 5 possessions, 5 touchdowns. They had 339 yards at the half. This is a very good Utah team, my number one surprise team. But when I went over the team with Coach Aranda this year and he talked about the new offense, I asked him, one of the questions was, we saw Richard Reese get those 2 kick return touchdowns late in the year. And I'm like, why didn't you use him more? He said he didn't fit the offense, but he fits this offense better. And last week, Reese was the leading rusher with 78 yards rushing. Dequan Finn looked really good coming in. He did have 2 interceptions in the game. But I think Finn is a good fit for the offense as well. And, of course, Aranda's now running the defense, and they only allowed 181 yards. So I like Utah to win the game, no doubt about it. They're at home in Rice-Eccles. They don't lose. But I had them a 2-touchdown favorite. I had them winning by 14 because I think Baylor is going to be a surprising team this year as well. So I'm going to call for Utah by 14. I think the spread is elevating a little bit, probably lean a little bit with Baylor plus the points, but you don't win a lot of money betting against Utah at home.
One of the most underrated rivalries in college football, that is the battle for the Cy-Hawk Trophy between Iowa and Iowa State. Last year, Iowa ended their season scoring 28 points in their last 4 games. Now, they did play Tennessee and Michigan in 2 of those games. They had an offensive explosion last week, Phil. They put up 40 points. I get it was Illinois State, but feels like this is always one of those games it's going to be low scoring. It's almost like an Army Navy. You got to just hammer the under every year. Is this a game where Iowa State feels like they have the edge because of Rocco Becht and maybe some things figured out offensively, or do you just put that much stock into the Iowa defense?
Well, I think when you take a look at Iowa and the series itself, I mean, Iowa's just it's always been tight. It's always been low scoring. In fact, if you take a look at the team that won the game in the last 4 of the last 5 years has not topped 20 points, and that's with the good reason that the under has gone 17-2 in this series. So just playing the under is an automatic, and I would play the under again here. When you look at Iowa State, they've got a heck of a defense this year, and while last week they gave up 295 yards in North Dakota, only 3 points offensively. They're going to struggle at times, and Iowa's defense is just so good. I mean, they've got the best defense coordinator in college football. They've got outstanding special teams, and they lit up Illinois State in the second half last week, but they did have only 6 points at the first half. And this is a white knuckle game. It's a rivalry game. Both coaches know it, and so I would expect the under is probably your best play, even though it's low at 35. 17-2 to the under is outstanding. Then you have to look at the fact that I thought Iowa's the better team, and they're at home, and they've controlled the series. And yes, I would have the number on the game low, but I was surprised that Vegas opened it up at 2.5. This seems more like a 3.5, 4 game. You know, I think that the home team should probably be favored by a little more than a field goal. So I lean with Iowa minus the points in this one because they're only laying 2.5. But I like the under probably a little bit better. I think it's going to be a great football game. Low scoring as always, down to the wire. I'm going to side with Iowa to come out with the win, though.
Let's jump to Kansas making a trip to Champaign to face Illinois. Last year, this was a double-digit win in Lawrence for the Jayhawks. This year, different dynamic. The way that Kansas moved the ball so effectively in this game against this defense of Illinois last year, Illinois was a pretty stout defensive football team when they stepped up and played their best game. But this is a different test with a different coordinator. Andy Kotelnicki's gone for Kansas. Jeff Grimes now has taken over the reins. They took care of business against the vaunted Lindenwood Lions last week in their opener. What do you see Kansas doing as a favorite, taking things on the road to Champaign to take on the Illini?
Yeah, and this is a game where, you know, my first reaction to it was, well, I watched the Illinois-Kansas game last week, and Illinois couldn't stop Kansas for nothing. Kansas was just rolling it up on them last year. And so when I talked to Coach Bielema, I'm like, I actually brought up the Kansas game. We normally just talk about the players, but I was like, what about that Kansas game, Coach? They moved the ball all over. And he said, Phil, we had the same thing happen in 2021. And then I thought back to 2021. They played Virginia. And watching that game, I mean, Virginia just sliced and diced them. They scored a touchdown almost every time they had the ball. They 42-20 or 42-14, and the game wasn't even that close. It should have probably been 59-14. Then they got Virginia at home the next year. Guess what? 24-3. Completely different game. And that's what I'm thinking is going to happen here. As you mentioned, Kotelnicki is gone as the offensive coordinator. Illinois is at home. And one guy to watch here, if you're going to watch this game, is their running back, Caden Fegan. He is a big boy, like 240 pounds, and he's also got speed. Altmaier looks a lot better this year at quarterback, had a 4-0 ratio last year after being uneven last year. This is an Illinois team bent on revenge. I think it's going to be much like we saw with the Virginia, where they got blown out on the road, beat them at home. I'm going to call for the upset here. I'm calling for Illinois to upset a ranked Kansas team at home. I've got a lot of faith in Coach Bielema in Illinois this year.
That's going to be a hell of a game. Another hell of a game this weekend is going to be Colorado at Nebraska. Last year, the Buffs just had their way with the Cornhuskers. Shedeur Sanders had a monster game, but it feels like the tide's turned a little bit for Nebraska. They've seemed to get some momentum going. They found a quarterback in Dylan Raiola. Feels like they're going to be able to keep pace with Colorado compared to last year. I feel like they're better in the trenches maybe than Colorado. I don't know, Phil. What do you think here? And does Colorado have a chance to go into Nebraska and win this one on the road?
You know, last year's game, you look at that final score and you say Colorado dominated, but if you're watching it, Nebraska really controlled the first 28 minutes of the game. They fumbled in Colorado territory. They missed a field goal. They fumbled. and then they got intercepted. And all of a sudden, Colorado got 2 scores in the last 2 minutes of the half, and then they took the momentum into the second half and beat them. Now, Nebraska's fired up. It's at home. It's at night. And they have a really good team. A couple of differences for Nebraska this year. Last year, they turned the ball over too much. They actually had a negative ratio out of their quarterbacks. They had 10 touchdown passes, 16 interceptions, and they had a ton of fumbles, especially out of the quarterback position with Jeff Sims. Now they've got Dylan Raiola at the quarterback position. And Raiola is a guy, he's a true freshman, but he's got poise well beyond his years. Last week he hit 70% and looked great. And I think that Raiola is going to be the big difference here. Plus, they've got a vastly upgraded receiving core. Isaiah Nayor, I remember watching him in Wyoming two years ago. He was outstanding, and I thought he was going to he transferred. I thought he was going to make a big impact at Texas. He did not. Now he's here at Nebraska. Last week, 121 yards receiving. He looked like he did at Wyoming. They have an offense, and they also have an outstanding defense. Last year, they only gave up 304 yards per game during the course of the season. So while you look at Colorado and you go Shadur Sanders, Travis Hunter, Jimmy Horn, LeJounte Wester, they've got the skill players. Nebraska's got the line of scrimmage. They got the better offensive line, better defensive line, better defense. And I think Nebraska has an improved offense. Plus, they're at home playing with revenge. I like Nebraska minus the points in this one to win it more comfortably than expected.
Well, Willie Fritz did not anticipate getting things started in Houston with a home loss by 20 points to UNLV. Now, granted, UNLV is probably better than a lot of people expect or give them credit for, but this was just a unilateral beatdown. Houston couldn't even manage 250 yards of offense. The last thing they need as they're trying to get right and recover from that is to make a trip to the Prairie as a 29-point underdog and face Oklahoma. What do you see playing out between Houston and the Sooners?
Now, you guys know on a Saturday, I got 12 TVs in front of me. And so I'm watching 12 games. And I was paying attention closely to the Houston UNLV game. And I count good plays, bad plays in my head. And in the first half, I would say UNLV had 85% good plays. Houston had very little going. Houston couldn't run. Houston couldn't pass. They couldn't stop UNLV's run. They couldn't stop UNLV's pass. The thing that shocked me was I'm trying to pay attention to 12 games all at one time. And I'm like, why is this score 14-0? It sure feels like it's 27-0. I mean, UNLV's just absolutely dominating the game. And then at the end of the game, Houston goes and gets a 90-yard drive for a touchdown. You look at the stats at the end of the game, they only got outgained by 49 yards. But that game was not a 49-yard game. UNLV dominated them much more in the final score. And that's what I expect here with a much better Oklahoma team at home. I think Oklahoma just dominates the game, start to finish, offensively, defensively. Look for Jackson Arnold to have a big game in this one. And overall, I just like Oklahoma to roll this one up. I'm surprised the number's only 4 touchdowns, frankly.
Bill, I have no idea what to expect with this next one. This is Texas Tech and Washington State. Tech needed overtime last week to beat Abilene Christian 52-51. They gave up over 500 yards through the air, another 100 yards on the ground. Meanwhile, Washington State, even though they won 70-30 against Portland State, they allowed over 200 yards through the air on the ground. Seems like this one's just going to be a high scoring type of game. May look like a basketball score at the end. Who comes out on top on this one?
Yeah, total 66.5, and I would still go over. And as you mentioned, neither defense played well last week. And I think Washington State probably really gets fired up for these games. And if you look at Texas Tech, they haven't fared well on the road under Joey McGuire. I believe they're 3-8 on the road. So you got a Washington State team that, even though they have the Apple Cup on deck, that's a big, big game for them. They want to prove that they're somebody. They want to get back in the Power Five. They're playing a Power Five team at home. I like what I saw to Mateer last week. They've got 2 quarterbacks, Mateer and Eckhouse, both played. And I liked what I saw to both of them. They had a 6-0 ratio on the end. Granted, Portland State's not Texas Tech, but Texas Tech, life and death against Abilene Christian, got outgained by 76 yards, needed that crucial 2-point conversion at the end. I'm going to call for Washington State to win this one at home. And like you said, a high-scoring game.
This is a surprising one, Phil. I find myself almost Arizona State might have a shot against Mississippi State. It feels that way, but and maybe I'm just putting too much into how they manhandled Wyoming in week 1. I didn't expect them to do that. Mississippi State took care of business against an FCS opponent. long trip for the Bulldogs to head out west. What do you see playing out with Arizona State? The Sun Devils, I think, are getting 6 the last I saw. What do you think's going to play out here?
No, the Sun Devils are giving 6. They're a 6-point home favorite
I'm
here.
sorry, the other way around, Mike. Yeah, the other way around.
Yeah, and I expect Arizona State to win this one at home. I like what I saw last week. Remember last year, their offensive line all banged up. Remember that at one point they couldn't even run the field goal unit on. They didn't have enough offensive linemen. They were running different formations. Their offensive line's in much better shape. I was surprised how they dominated Wyoming last week. I thought Wyoming was going to give Arizona State a game, and you look at 48-7. Wyoming's touchdown came in the final minutes, one late drive. They had a 241 to 53 yard edge at the half. They just totally dominated that game start to finish. They've got Scatabo at the running back spot. Sam Leavitt looked really good at quarterback, and the defense played well. Now, Mississippi State, while they look good against Eastern Kentucky last week, I'm still not sold on them this year yet. We'll have to see how they do. I think Arizona State's in better shape at home, at night, in the desert. I'm going to go with the Sun Devils to win this one by more than a touchdown.
All right, Phil. And now, yep, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it's almost pitting the bottom of both leagues against each other, at least what the media expects to be the bottom of both leagues. And Phil, that one kind of, I did look at that wrong. And I wasn't that surprised that it was 6 points the other way. But now that I'm saying it, boy, you pointed that out. I'm like, wow. Mississippi State must have some issues, but go ahead, Skyler.
Yeah. So now to the hottest ticket in all of college football this weekend. That's West Virginia and Albany, kicking off at 6 o'clock on ESPN Plus. Obviously, the Mountaineers had a poor outing last week against Penn State, but it is a top 10 team. This feels like a really good opportunity to get right, to figure some things out. Phil, initial thoughts on last week's game against Penn State. Does it change your mind about this Mountaineer team, and what do you see unfolding against the Great Danes of Albany?
No, it doesn't change my mind about West Virginia one bit. Penn State's a really, really good team, and they've got a really good offense coordinator, defense coordinator. It's sort of like the Clemson-Georgia game. Everybody's like, well, Clemson's offense is really bad this year. No, they played Georgia's defense, okay? They're not going to take on Georgia's defense the rest of the year. You calm down. And what I see in this game is this. Last year, Albany was great, 11-4, got all the way to the FCS semifinals. But as I mentioned, I've got metrics articles in my FCS magazine this year, and Albany's hitting going down in most of them, including the stock market indicator. They have 6 starters back on offense, but they lose their quarterback, Poffenberger. Defensively, they lose all 11 starters. And last week, Albany was a 22.5-point favorite at home against Long Island. Should have won the game comfortably. They actually trailed in the third quarter, and while they won 27-21, they were actually outgained 358-255. And the history of West Virginia says this. Off a loss, last year they lose to Penn State. They beat Duquesne 56-17. The previous year, they were off a loss to Kansas. They beat Towson 65-7. Off a loss to off a loss to Maryland. They beat Long Island 66-0. They will put the hammer down. I've got West Virginia putting the hammer down, getting that confidence back. They need that confidence with the backyard brawl coming up. I'm going to call for West Virginia to win this one 56-10. Unfortunately, I don't see a doggone line on the game.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen a line on the game yet?
No, not yet.
Haven't. I was going to ask you.
Yeah, I think it'll probably come out late Friday is usually what I think they do.
Yeah, last year they were coming up earlier. They at least had one spot coming out where you had an idea where the line was going to be, but they actually have not posted a line on a single FBS versus FCS game this yet, which is really burning me up a little bit here.
Well, I feel better because I was going to ask Phil what the line was because I couldn't find it, but I'll ask one more question, a little more granular about this Albany game, Phil. These games come in all styles and fashions, right? You fast starts, sluggish starts. Ultimately, the end result is hopefully what you want it to be. But do you see Albany? Long Island did run the football effectively on them last week. They have Greg Gattuso, a former Penn State defensive lineman. That doesn't sit well with him. They're shorthanded, yes, but he is not going to want to let that happen 2 weeks in a row. Again, he's not equipped to necessarily stop it. But from a game plan standpoint or otherwise, 4 returning offensive linemen, he's going to try and play to the strengths of his roster in front of a tough crowd in Morgantown. Do you see at least Albany creating a sluggish start for West Virginia before we hopefully can ultimately separate after that? Or West Virginia right out of the gates just as by virtue of what happened at Penn State, we're so ticked off we just explode after one quarter, and maybe midway through the second quarter, this thing's decided.
I see it. West Virginia right from the beginning, just taking care of business, no doubt about it. Coming off of last week, now there's questions. They're going to answer those questions. West Virginia's going to look really good right out of the box this week.
Bill, we appreciate your time so much. As always, thank you for coming on. We'll talk to you next week, and get ready for that backyard brawl. And hopefully you got some good news, some good analysis for us next week, as you always do.
Sounds great. And don't forget, guys, get that FCS magazine. It's available at philsteele.com right now. Become an instant FCS expert. A lot of fun talking football, and it's going to be a much better conversation next week as far as what West Virginia did the previous week.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Phil, thank you so much. Hang tight. We'll be right back to put up the finishing touches of this show. And once again, Phil Steele, go check out his stuff. Get that FCS preview.
There are better-known tractors in the world than Coyote. Ones with bigger names, longer histories, more popular hats, cute toy lines. But there's not a single tractor ever been built that's better equipped to do the dirty work. So we'll just focus on what really matters. Coyote, we dig dirt.
Get 0% financing for up to 84 months with approved credit on select Coyote tractors in stock now at Johnston Equipment. Route 33 between Weston and Buchanan.
As always, great stuff from Phil Steele. That's what you get when you talk to one of the best and brilliant minds in all of college football. Again, if you haven't picked up that FCS or even the FBS magazine, please go and check it out. He's got really great, extensive work on every team in college football. But, Jed, it sounds like Phil feels pretty good about the Mountaineers this week, as you should, but it'd be a little more comforting if what he says comes true, and that it's just right from the get-go, pedal to the metal, no dragging this into the second or third quarter, get Nico Marchiol in the game, maybe even get Khalil Wilkins, some of those other guys involved in, and get some rest for your starters heading into that backyard brawl.
One of the games we didn't talk about, BYU tonight against SMU as a heavy dog. That's a game I'm going to want to check out as well. But we talked to him about 11 of the Big 12 games, so at some point we had to cut him loose. But a couple of things he said that interested me. I thought he made a really good point about that Kansas at Illinois game, talking back to the Illinois matchup against Virginia a handful of years ago and how they rebounded the next year. Basically what he's saying, and this is why this game should matter to Mountaineer fans, in a short few weeks, Kansas comes to Morgantown. And if they lose to Illinois, they won't be a ranked team coming to Morgantown. But if they beat Illinois, there's a decent chance they might. They got a couple games before that. But so that's interesting there. And once again, you and I were talking about this during the break, Skylar. I looked at that Arizona State game wrong. I just assumed that they were the dog in that game.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. They're actually, as Phil said, giving 6 against Mississippi State. So that doesn't bode well for Mississippi State. And maybe Arizona State's a little bit better than people giving them credit for. They dominated. Yes, it's Wyoming. Say what you want, but nobody was expecting them to dominate them in the fashion that they did. So, always interesting points that Phil makes, and also you got Northern Arizona. We didn't talk about all these Big 12 games, but we hit some of the key matchups. It's interesting how the schedule overall plays out this week. There's only a handful or even a couple big top 25 games that are really marquee. Most of the big games are in the Big 12. They really are, including the top 25 games. Most of the intriguing games on anybody's slate this week that everybody's going to be paying attention to are in the Big 12. West Virginia just happens to have their FCS game this weekend, but let's take care of business as well and do what Phil said, jump on them early. I mean, I want this type of game that Nico Marchiol, for instance, we talked about this in the preview, got to play 43 snaps last year against Duquesne. And after about 20 minutes of play, it wasn't looking that way when it was a 14-10 game. So if you can take care of business early, stay healthy, get your 2s and 3s in, polish things up, and be prepared as Pitt, crosses swords with Cincinnati, because next week you got the big one coming up. So let's do that against these great names.
Absolutely. Just pounce on them early. Don't let them hang around. Just let this thing get over with before it even really gets started. So one final thank you to our newest friends of the program, Johnston's Equipment. Get 0% financing for up to 84 months with approved credit on select Coyote tractors, in stock now at Johnston Equipment, Route 33 between Weston and Buchanan. And that'll do it for today's episode and for this week's show. We'll have, I don't know if Wes will be doing a post-game reaction on the game or not. If not, we'll be back early next week to put the finishing touches on West Virginia, Albany before we start diving in. Yes.
If you haven't had a chance, double back and watch our Albany preview, because we didn't just break down Albany and the Mountaineers, but we also got the backstory from Owen. It was really cool. He got to talk for a long time about how things played out with the McAfee show in Morgantown, and gave us kind of the behind the scenes with how all that came together. And there's some really cool content there that I think fans will appreciate.
Oh yeah. First 25 or so minutes of that show is all Owen talking about the Pat McAfee weekend. And that was a lot of interesting stories to hear. And I'm sure there's more that he'll tell in the future. So be sure to double back on that. And as always, be an ear and tell an ear about your new favorite WV football podcast, In the Gun. For the signal caller, Jed Drenning, I'm Skylar Callahan. Thank you for watching. We'll see you guys here next week.
ITG.
The fun doesn't have to stop here.
Be sure to hit subscribe and never miss an episode.
If you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback,
be sure to follow us on X at In the Gun Podcast.
Join us again next time.
Until then,
tell an ear to tell an ear about your new favorite WVU football podcast.
This mission is over. It's over.